So let's look at how to back up an SQL database. Now, I'm going to start by creating a folder to hold my backups. So I'm going to open up my file manager. I'm going to go to my C drive, and on the C drive, now SQL actually creates a folder for backups, but it buries it. I want to make this nice and easy to access. So I'm just going to create a new folder called backup right off of my C drive, and I'm going to move all of my backups there. Okay, now let's take a look at the AdventureWorks database. So I'm going to right click on AdventureWorks, go to Tasks, and there it is, Backup. All right, now before we get into any of this, I'm actually going to hop out of here, but I want to show you something right here. And our recovery model is full, which we set in a previous video. So that full recovery model gives me the option to do a full backup, a differential backup, and a transaction log backup. We'll talk about these here in a few minutes. But before we do, I'm going to expand the system databases. I'm going to right click on the master database, and I'm going to go to tasks and backup. Now you'll notice here our recovery model is simple. And one of the things we said when we were doing the video on doing your recovery model is that the simple recovery model doesn't give you as many options. So under backup type for the simple recovery model, all I can do is a full backup. That's it, nothing else. Okay, so closing this, back to our AdventureWorks database. Go back to tasks and backup. Okay, I'm going to start by getting rid of this because I don't want to use that particular file. That's the backup file that we downloaded from Microsoft when we stored it with, so I'm just going to remove that from my backup destinations. Now, I can choose to back up either the entire database or specific files and file groups. By the way, everything we're doing in here in the GUI, you can also do from command line using the Transact SQL language. So I want to go ahead and do the full backup, and I'm going to set a new location, and my options are backup to disk or URL. So I'm going to go with disk, and I'm going to add, and I'm going to choose my location, and here you'll see that path that Microsoft created for us. So it's under Program Files, Microsoft SQL, SQL 2015.class, which is my instance name, SQL Backup. All right, that's why I wanted to go with just, oops, didn't want to do that, C:\backup. And I'm going to call this aw.bak. So AW for AdventureWorks.bak for backup. And you hit OK. So there's my backup location. Now, let's talk about what some of these options here are. A full backup is, well, a full backup. It will back up everything in your database. It doesn't necessarily back up everything in your transaction logs. The full backup, now, when you're doing a restore, it doesn't make sense to do a full backup every hour, right? Because of the way Microsoft SQL handles its transactions, you'll have transactions stored in the transaction log before they get committed to the actual data files. And the full backup will back up all of the data files. Well, what we want to do typically, that's a pretty good sized backup. So what we'll typically do if we're doing a full recovery model is we will do a full backup every so often, and then we'll do transaction log backups as well. And those transaction log backups will allow us to be more flexible in how much we can recover. If we just do a full backup, let's say once a day, and I do transaction log backups, then I can basically back up or restore to my last full day. But I can do transaction logs every hour, every half hour, every 15 minutes, whatever. And then I can restore those transaction logs as well. So the way the recovery process would work is you would do the last full backup, and then you would restore every transaction log since your last full backup. Okay. The differential backup is a way of short-circuiting that a little bit. So the differential backup will back up everything that has changed since the last full backup. So I could do a full backup every day, a differential backup every 4 hours, and a transaction log backup every half an hour. And then what I would do when I went to recover is I would recover my last full backup, every differential backup after my last the last full backup that I was recovering, and then every transaction log backup since the last differential backup that I had just recovered. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start by creating a full backup here. Now let's take a look at our media options and our backup options as well. In our media options, we're going to back up to an existing media set. We can append or overwrite. Append just means I'm going to add more backups to this file, which is honestly not a bad idea. It actually simplifies your life considerably. If I ever want to reset it, then I would overwrite all existing backups. I also have an option to back up to a new media set and wipe out everything else. Now, I can verify the backup when finished. I can perform a checksum before writing to media, which is something that I can do then to verify the accuracy of my backup, right? So when I go to restore it, I can check that and check the checksum and make sure it still matches. And then I can choose to continue on error. These options here are for transaction log backups, which we'll get to here in a minute. And then we have other backup options like we can set it to expire, we can set compression, we can set encryption. All right, I'm going to run just a straight full backup to get us started. So I'm going to click OK. And this will execute, you'll see down here, it's executing my full backup. This is a full backup. It's a relatively small database, about 200 megabytes. But you can see it's going to take a little while. Ideally, by the way, you would probably want to back up to a drive other than the one that your data files are actually on. And also realize that this is backing up to a URL or to a local disk. So if you want an offsite backup, then you need to either use an offsite URL or you can use something like a tape backup. Once your SQL backup is done, you can take that file, put it onto an external media, either a removable hard drive, tape, whatever, take it offsite. All right, so now we have a full backup. Now let's say an hour has passed, we've had some transactions in and out, things are going on. I want to do a transaction log backup. Now if I'm doing that through the GUI, and by the way, this is one of the challenges here with doing this through the GUI. If we script it, then we can automate it using the SQL agent, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I can script it and run those scripts. If I do it manually, it's kind of a time-consuming process, especially if I'm doing a transaction log backup every hour, right? So we get away with that using the SQL agent, which we'll talk about later on. So let's go back to our backup. And it now remembers what we did, right? So we have our backup media here. We have our backup time. Now this has been an hour or so afterwards, and this time I want to do a transaction log backup. So I'm going to choose just a transaction log. Now notice these options have went away. Go back to my media options. These all still exist. But now I've got this right here. I can truncate the transaction log. Now this is important because that transaction log is just going to keep growing and growing and growing and growing. So when I do a backup of it, basically I save what's there into a backup and then I cut that transaction log and we start over again. Now this last one, back up the tail of the log and leave the database in a restoring state. That is something that we will do just before a recovery. So let's say I have my backups. I've got my transaction log backups happening every half hour or so. And I need to restore a database that dies at like 9:45. So my last transaction log backup would have been 15 minutes earlier. So what I can do before I do my recovery is I can do this. Back up the tail of the log, which will be basically everything since the last transaction log backup. But this right here is the key thing, and leave the database in a restoring state. So what that does is that backs up that last little tail of the log and then leaves it in a restoring state so that users can't actually use it. We need to go to the restoring state before we actually restore our data. That's what that's for. So in a recovery scenario, I back up the tail of the log, leave it in a restoring state, and then I go through and do all of my other database restores. But this isn't that case. I'm just doing a regular backup, so I'm going to truncate the transaction log and not back up the tail and hit OK. Now, notice how fast that was. Now, admittedly, I haven't had any transactions here, right? So you would see it actually take a little bit longer. But it is way, way faster doing a transaction log backup is way, way faster than trying to do a full backup, which is why we do, or even a differential backup, which is why we'll typically build our backup strategy around those full backups, the differential backups, and then the transaction log backups. Okay, one more thing I want to show you right here. Right click, go to tasks and backup. Now we have this option to do a copy only backup. So here's what happens. Every time that I do a full backup, I reset my counter. So I do my differential backups, which is everything that's changed since the last full backup. And then I do my transaction log backups, which is everything in my transaction log since the last full backup. When I do a copy only backup, it doesn't reset that sequence. So let's say I do a full backup and then I change, 67 records and I do a differential backup and then I change another 80 records and I do another differential backup. Then I change another 40 records and I do another differential backup. When I do a full backup again, then it marks all that complete, and so it's no longer backing up. My differential backups are no longer backing up all those other changes. It's just doing since that new full backup. What a copy only backup does is it does a backup, but it doesn't reset those things so that they don't get backed up again in the next differential cycle. So it's a little bit of a funky thing here. We'll do it sometimes when we don't want to disrupt our sequence of differential and transaction log backups, but I want a point in time backup, right? So I'm getting ready to make a major change. I want to do a backup right now and do a full backup, and I'm going to do it as a copy only backup so it doesn't reset that sequence of differential and transaction log backups. That's what that's for. Okay, so that should give us an idea of how we go about backing up our SQL database.